Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 49 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Detroit Red Wings, in which the Sharks have lost 3-2 in overtime. This is the second and final meeting between these two teams, and in the first one, the Sharks had a pretty exciting and high goal-scoring game against these Detroit Red Wings, but in the end, they would come up with the loss by a score of 7-4. Here tonight, the goal scoring was much lower. It was a much more closely played game in terms of defense, but in the end, the result ends up being very similar. The Sharks lose, though they do manage to get the singular point in overtime. At least the sort of good news, I guess, is that compared to the last couple of games, the Sharks were definitely better here tonight. Compared to the Bruins game, they were better just by nature of the fact that they were against a much weaker opponent, but also in comparison to the Blue Jackets game, where the Sharks went up against the worst team in the league and lost. It was nice to see the Sharks go up against a still rather weak team, though better than the Sharks themselves, and actually play a decent game, even if in the end they would end up losing. Now, in the first period, it was pretty closely played, pretty even, I would say, either way, and as such, there was no score by the end of those 20 minutes. It was only in the second period where things started to explode a bit, and it looked like maybe we could have a relatively high-scoring game in the end. It would be the Detroit Red Wings striking first. The Sharks would answer pretty soon after with a Timo Meier 28th goal of the season wraparound goal, one of the rarer seen goals scored in the NHL. Then the Red Wings would take the lead back once more with a goal from Rasmussen before Couture, on a very effective last-minute shift of the second period, would manage to get that one and tie this game up at 2. And so going into the third period on the road in Detroit, the Sharks had one objective here from their perspective, which was to play a better period than the Red Wings and get the victory. But that didn't actually end up happening. I would say for the first 15 minutes of this third period, the Red Wings were significantly better than the Sharks. I won't say that the Red Wings were getting so many fantastic chances for themselves, because honestly, besides like some decent zone time for Detroit, there really wasn't all that much doing. But the Sharks also got very, very little going offensively for themselves. There was like maybe 2 shifts in those first 15 minutes of that third period where the Sharks actually looked decent. They did pick it up at the end of that third period, had a couple of okay chances to try and end the game there, but we would eventually go to overtime, where the Sharks have had so many issues thus far this season. They are now approaching the double digits in terms of overtime losses, and we're only just over halfway through this season. The Sharks could end up, if this pace continues, with like 15 or 16 overtime losses, so it is not a great look. And you can see as the Sharks start off, they immediately send over a trio of Nico Sturm, Matt Nieto, and Erik Karlsson to start this overtime. They lose the faceoff, immediately get sort of confused in the neutral zone, which allows Dylan Larkin to literally just skate right through and get a good chance on net. If not for Erik Karlsson cutting him off with some decent speed, Larkin would have had even more room to make that play. And then the Sharks stand over the trio of still Erik Karlsson with Barabanov and Couture, and even though Couture ends up winning the faceoff, the Red Wings work harder to get the puck off of the lost draw, and eventually a scramble in front leads to Kopp tapping this in. So it is just a cascade of mistakes from the San Jose Sharks in this overtime, and that has really been a theme for the Sharks, not only in overtimes, but even in shootouts, where they just have not had any sort of strength besides very early on. I believe the Sharks did win their first 2 overtime games of this season, and I think that's been pretty much only losses besides like a shootout win since then. So pretty disappointing there, and the Sharks, like I said, they lose it 3-2. On to the players to talk about. We had a set of lineup changes, which was essentially just Labanc coming back into the lineup onto the first line and then essentially just moving people down by one line. So Labanc comes back in with Meier and Hertl. It was a question of who would get substituted out. That ends up being Gadjevich, which is something I'll get to a bit later when I talk about the fourth line. But it was honestly way overdue that Labanc would come into the lineup. The one healthy scratch made sense. The second one certainly was not too bad. I thought the third one was a bit overkill, and the fourth one was massive overkill, and yet that ended up being the case, and lo and behold, Labanc comes back here on this first line, and this first line continues to put up a fantastic performance as though it did not really miss a beat. No offense to Mikey Eyssimont, and while he was doing a very good job for his role on that top line. The fact is that it is majorly carried by Meier and to a slightly lesser extent Tomas Hertl. And so whoever you're necessarily putting onto that top line, as long as they're, a competent player like Eyssimont was and like Labanc is, you're probably going to have an effective line. And here tonight, they definitely had some really good shifts in the offensive zone. Obviously, Meier did score to get his 28th of the season. And generally, they probably could have even had a couple of goals more in this one. So an effective game and a nice little return game for Kevin Labanc, who was really effective. I felt more earlier in the game. It kind of fell off later on, but still. On the second line, we had Couture and Barabanov being joined by Eyssimont. Like I said, it was essentially just everyone getting bumped down one slot. So Eyssimont moves from first to second line. And I thought Eyssimont actually still played rather well here in this role on the second line. It wasn't amazing. It certainly wasn't at the level of the first line that we saw in this game. But it was still, a couple of chances here and there. One interesting thing that should be noted is that by the end of the game, Eyssimont actually got moved down to the third line, and we saw Nick Bonino get bumped up to the second line. Now, I didn't have that much of an issue with Eyssimont getting tossed down to the third line. I thought, like I said, Eyssimont was good. He wasn't, though, amazing or anything, and maybe the Sharks were just trying to spark some offense, but is there really a justification for moving Nick Bonino up to the second line? Because I didn't notice anything from Nick Bonino. In fact, I thought Eyssimont had played better up to that point than Nick Bonino, and yet, for whatever reason, number 13 continues to get that favoritism, and he ends up on that second line to end the game, and they do very, very little. They had one good chance in that third period, but that was not even close to because of Nick Bonino doing anything. It was essentially just the other players on the ice at that point coming very close to being able to score. Otherwise, not really anything there. When it comes to the third line, there was Nick Bonino, who I just talked about, of course, Nico Sturm and Matt Nieto. Nieto bumped down from the second line to the third line. I actually thought Sturm looked decent enough. He's definitely been one of the better Sharks players over these past few games, even in some of those losses. That can be said, besides, I guess, the Bruins one. That was just sort of a bump in the road for everybody. But we did see that one amazing play from Nico Sturm in the third period where he almost scored. A pass from Eyssimont. He dekes out one player and goes for it. We've seen actually an increased level of skill in a couple of the plays that Nico Sturm has also made over these past few games, and a couple of them have indeed resulted in goals, but a couple of them have just been nice little plays to sort of talk about at this point. So it has been interesting to watch Nico Sturm over these last few games. When it comes to Matt Nieto, I thought Nieto also had an okay game, nothing amazing. The fact is that he went from playing on a line with Couture and Barabanov to playing with Bonino and Sturm, which is obviously going to be a notable drop-off in terms of skill. And since Nieto was never really the play driver on that second line, you're not expecting him to still be the play driver on the third line either. And so, his general level will technically drop, but mostly just because of the talent that he is playing with. When it comes to the fourth line, we saw Gregor move down from third to fourth, and he joined Lindblom and Lorentz on that fourth line. Like I said, Gadjevich was the odd man out, which honestly did not really surprise me all that much. Lorentz is the center on this fourth line, so it's a bit more difficult to remove him. And out of Lindblom and Gadjevich, I felt Lindblom had been the slightly better player. And here tonight, I actually thought Lindblom played rather well, probably the more effective player on this fourth line. Gregor still looked pretty decent. Lorentz was also kind of okay, I guess. Lorentz maybe the slightly weaker one of the three, but I did actually enjoy a couple of the plays that Lindblom made in the offensive zone, so I guess that is a positive. When it comes to the defensive side of things, or at least the defenseman side of things, we of course have Erik Karlsson. The last time the Sharks played the Detroit Red Wings, like I said, the Sharks lost 7-4, but on those 4 Sharks goals, Erik Karlsson participated in each and every single one of them with one of his multiple 4-point nights on this season. Now, he was obviously not as lucrative in this game here tonight, since the Sharks only scored 2 goals, but he still factored in on each of those goals. He finishes the game with those 2 assists, and certainly not for a lack of chances. Erik Karlsson played a stupendous game on the offensive side of things. We saw in the third period his absolute just showing off, showboating type of situation, not in the negative connotation, but in the sort of I'm much better than you type of situation. near the offensive zone blue line, where he dekes out not one but two Detroit players before getting an opportunity on net. So that was definitely a fantastic show. We also saw in that very same third period, I thought this was much more of a comical type of play, but we saw Erik Karlsson pressured by a couple of Detroit forecheckers. He kind of avoids them with some very nice stick handling, and then by the end of it, David Perron, who was one of those Detroit forecheckers, ends up just sort of throwing his stick, not necessarily because in frustration. Obviously the stick was probably just broken, and so he has to obviously replace it at the bench, but it was just kind of funny to see him get a bit embarrassed by Erik Karlsson to then have him like throw the stick. It's just like a symbol of how exactly Erik Karlsson has really just been showing off the difference of skill between him and many of the players who are trying to defend him. And so 2 assists in this game, that puts him on 64 points on the entire year. He continues to just absolutely dominate in so many of these games for the San Jose Sharks. When it comes to the rest of the defense, we did see Benning get inserted back into the lineup after his sickness that saw him miss the Boston Bruins game. It should be noted that the Sharks got absolutely demolished by the Bruins. I would not say Matt Benning missing was one of the reasons for that. He comes back here tonight. I thought he was definitely very give and take, very Matt Benning type of game, because there were definitely a couple of plays that you were saying, wow, can't believe Matt Benning lost that battle, lost that puck. There was a very good chance for the Red Wings around halfway through that third period where Benning goes into the corner and then just completely loses the puck to the incoming Detroit player, and that allows for a fantastic chance on net. And then there were also a couple of other very solid, very safe defensive plays from Matt Benning where he made the smart play and kind of settled things down. So in the end, a very, very up and down game for Matt Benning in his return here tonight after that sickness missed game. And finally, on to the goaltender here. It was James Reimer in nets for the San Jose Sharks. A quite solid game, I guess you could say. Nothing amazing from James Reimer, but certainly better than what we have seen usually from him. Obviously, his stats are quite ugly thus far this season compared to the beginning of the year, when many fans were hopeful that James Reimer could be moved at the deadline for even up to like a second round pick. That definitely doesn't seem as realistic anymore. He's going to need more games like this, and even better than games like this, if Reimer wants to end up getting traded here out of San Jose. A couple of these goals certainly not going to fault him for. That Copp one was definitely very difficult, but we take a look at the Rasmussen one, not an impossible save to make. So generally it's just been more of the same from James Reimer, with maybe a slight uptick because he didn't let in 4 or 5 goals like we have seen many times this year. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action. That will be on Friday, as they'll play 2 more games prior to the bye week / all-star weekend type of situation where they'll end up missing an entire week of play. We'll see if the Sharks can finish this road trip off strong, because right now they are all 3 losses. Class dismissed.